for development. We are excited to have the seminar today, and we're going to dive deeper into how we can move beyond piloting new approaches or testing new technologies, and even beyond scaling individual projects to really mainstreaming these approaches and technologies and bringing them to the core of organizations. And for this, we have a really great setup of speakers lined up. First, we will hear from the director of the OECD Development Coordination Directorate, and that's Pilar Garrido. And then from Benjamin Kampf, who leads the OECD Innovation for Development Facility. We're then super pleased to welcome Rosie Collington. She's a research fellow at the Institute for Innovation for Public Purpose. And earlier this year, she published a book called The Big Con, together with Mariana Mazzucato. So we'll hear a little bit from that book. And after that, we want to get very practical and hear from colleagues who have successfully brought novel approaches to the core of their organizations. We'll hear from Reena Nadler, who works as an organizational learning specialist at USAID, and also from Christof Hawle, who's a digital innovation specialist at UNDP. So a great lineup, and throughout this seminar, we want to make sure that we are leaving space for you to engage with the speakers, to ask your questions, and to do so, we ask you to please use the Q&A box. That, well, actually, I'm not sure we have a Q&A box, so we figure that out. We'll let you know if it's the Q&A box or the chat. Because it tends to be the most popular question, I can tell you upfront that we are recording this session and we'll share it together with the slides with everyone who joined. And with that, enough from me. It's my pleasure to hand over to our first speaker. As mentioned, Pilar Garrido is the director of the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. Before joining the OECD, she was the Minister of Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica, responsible, amongst others, for development cooperation policy. She has also served as the Deputy Minister for Planning and Economic Policy. She was the Chief of Staff, Senior Advisor of the Technical Secretariat of the 2030 Agenda. Long list of achievements, Pilar. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you. Over to you for your insights and setting the scene for the seminar.
Thank you very much. And dear members of the OECD I-32 group, and dear colleagues from the UN system and from across OECD organizations and other parts of the international development sector, a very warm welcome to today's seminar. We at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, we help set international principles and standards for development cooperation, and we monitor how members deliver on their commitments. Drawing upon the expertise of the entire OECD, we support members of the OECD Development Committee assistance and partners with analysis, data, and guidance. In 2021, we launched the Innovation for Development Facility and the I-32 group to support DAC members with insights, connections for peer learning, and to explore new possibilities. This meeting is a session of our I-32 group, but unlikely the regular I-32 seminars, it is open to the public. I am also pleased to see the collaboration with the UN Innovation Network as bilateral and multilateral organizations alike and working on building institutional capabilities related to emerging technologies and novel approaches. Today's seminar is titled The Adoption of Innovation in My International Development Organizations. And I will leave some of the difficult questions to my colleague Ben, who is going to clarify how we frame those concepts, adoption and innovation, in the context of today's discussions. What I would like to share to frame the inputs you will be hearing today is this. As you know, we all, the global community, are off track our SDGs, and we need to achieve them. But for that, we don't only need more innovation, as we normally say, but we need better innovation. And allow me to skip the case on why we need innovation in international development cooperation and in international development, because that's a given today's audience. I assume that we all agree that we need to challenge the status quo, and that change is basically the way forward in our business model. So today we want not only to challenge business as usual, but also dominant innovation practices. Development organizations from the bilateral and multilateral system, as well as international non-governmental organizations, have a role to play. in advancing inclusive innovation with partners in low and middle income countries. To do so effectively and with legitimacy, we need to change our institutions. So today's discussions will focus on this institutional reform component, and specifically, how can we better explore what works to do it strategically and to strategically move once this innovation to the core of an organization. If you have been following initiatives to leverage approaches such as human-centered design or foresight or behavioral science for more effective development and cooperation, and you have been looking at making emerging technologies such as blockchain or AI work for better outcomes, then you might also share a sense of frustration. Too many initiatives did not unfold the impact at an appropriate scale, and in many cases, those organizations work with the same approaches and technologies. It's still branded as innovation, but some of them are more than 10 years old after the initial work had started. If a specific approach such as foresight adds value to how an organization works, then how can it be better integrated into regular business processes, and how could it be better leveraged when appropriate? How can we work in such approach? And this is often confined to islands of excellence within organizations, but can we make this accessible to everyone in an organization? This is overall the challenge that we want to frame, and this is basically the adoption challenge. We will explore good practices from USAID and from UNDP, and we will also hear about the findings from our recently published working paper. It is important to underline that there is no blueprint for building institutional capabilities from specific approaches and emerging technologies. We did, however, find commonalities across organizations and teams in order to find successful work towards that adoption. A key challenge, as we see, and I'm sure you all feel familiar with this, is resources, financial and human resources. So how to secure sufficient funding or dedicated functions that enable an organizational change to work as an informed user of an approach or technology. Back in 2021, we published a report on innovation capacities and capabilities across the DAC membership. So please allow me to quote from this publication to further contextualize today's conversation. Dedicated innovation teams typically balance innovation commissioning and program management with technical advisory work. In general, these skills are not invested in. Innovation teams are considerably overstretched. Against this backdrop and realizing that budgets are generally tight, I invite you to participate today actively in this seminar and in this conversation. We hope that our work in this seminar will be very inspirational to you and will help you inform future work, including work that pursues building dedicated capabilities and approaches and technologies, de facto moving them from innovation technologies into space, freeing up some time and resources for innovation teams to focus on emerging challenges and opportunities. We know there is no shortage of those. There will never be. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you a great session.
Thank you so much, Pilar, for setting the scene for us and for providing this context, really helpful. We have lots of colleagues from all across the UN, from international organizations, from governments joining us. So this topic is close to the heart of many people interested in learning. So it's really great to see. Then I'd like to hand over to you. As mentioned, you lead the I-32 group in the OECD, and you and the team, you've recently conducted some research on the adoption of innovation. While there's no blueprint, we heard commonalities do exist. Have you been able to shed some light into why organizations are struggling and what we can do to enable the spread of innovation or the adoption of innovation to become part of core of organizations?
I think we did. Thanks, Johanna, and thanks, Pilar. Warm welcome, everyone. I'm grateful, Pilar, that you laid out the challenge. No need to reiterate it. Just to clarify, what we were really interested in is, why is it that organizations, often but not always, through the innovation teams, spot something promising, an emerging technology or an approach that could add value to their mission, but then it very often just remains in isolated use in an organization, or sometimes it's used by several islands of excellence. We found that sometimes it becomes central to your organization, but very often because of the senior management pushing for a certain technology. And with that senior management then often leaving after a short or medium amount of time, there hardly is any legacy. So we are interested, how can we bring something to the core of an organization? how do you make it accessible to everyone who should use it and clear when to use it? So we undertook this research, and my colleague Panika Chunchunwala, who's also with us today and now works with UNDP, and I looked into 5 different countries among a broad array of literature and conducted case studies from USAID, the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Agence Française de Développement, Germany's GIZ, and from KOICA, the development agency of the Republic of Korea. And huge thanks to the colleagues also here online with us today, Pippa Ranger, Kamal Dadi, Eric Bignon, and others. Huge thanks for your collaboration. Let me just clarify 2 things. Today, when we talk about innovation, what we mean is overarchingly an approach. Think human-centered design, think behavioral science, or overarchingly a technology, think AI, think blockchain. And usually we refer as innovation predominantly as a process with distinct characteristics. But today what we are after is how do you build capabilities on such an approach? And what we are not referring to today is a specific solution powered by that approach or by that technology. Think AI-powered dashboard, a predictive analytics system to forecast outbreaks of cholera in a conflict area. Or think of a behavioral experiment that successfully improved saving behavior of recipients of cash transfers. And for today, when we talk about adoption, we mean essentially the same as institutionalizing a way of working or building the capability of a specific approach. And with that out of the way, I want to quickly give a shout out to 6 amazing researchers who supported us with putting this paper together as part of a capstone project. And this group of formerly Columbia students is depicted here on the slide, and many of you are here with us today. Huge thanks again. It was great working with you. And with this, what did we find? Why is it not happening? Well, I'm sure you've come across these fallacies. First, what we found is the lure of novelty. Very often, work on specific approaches and emerging technologies is informed by hype cycles that either leads to increased attention of innovation teams and regular teams of development practitioners or senior managers. And when attention shifts from, let's say, blockchain around 2018 to AI in 21, so does the funding and the senior management support for experiments with this without really having built capabilities or an evidence base that it should indeed or not be part of the toolkit. Then the team traits and mandate, particularly when we look at core innovation teams, they're really often made up of pioneers who are very supportive of program teams who want to test a novel approach or technology to be more effective and drive progress against specific development challenges. They very often have little experience, sometimes little interest in changing the mothership and doing that hard grinding work of change management. And usually they don't even have the mandate for this. That's linked to misaligned incentives. We found in many results frameworks, incentives for having innovation projects, such as the number of innovative projects that are being tested or scaled. But we have not found one results framework on a corporate level that incentivizes the adoption, that moving a way of working that has sufficient evidence that it should be part of the toolkit into the core. Then time horizons, that links to the point on evidence. In order to generate that evidence that, let's say, working with behavioral science in order to drive through experiments, behavior change among constituents actually works, we are not looking at 1 or 2 years usually, but in order to really evoke demonstrable effects, time horizons of at least 4 to 5 years. And that's very often not long enough for senior management's attention or the attention of the innovation team to last, going back to the first point. And lastly, that's a fallacy mainly on the side of innovation team to sometimes oversell the potential of a specific approach, as if pretty much every development challenge should be approached with a human-centered design mindset and worked on with those toolkits. So with that said, what are pathways to act as an informed user or an informed supporter of a specific approach or technology? We found differences, important one, between when it comes to institutionalizing tech capabilities and approaches, but more importantly, the commonality stood out in terms of how those teams approached, how do we move it from the edge to the core? And this is what I will highlight today. 3 features. And I will speak about the first and the third, and really invite you to check out our paper. And I will also add the link to a summary paper that Emma Proud and I co-authored together that highlights the main factors. So it starts with a vision. Now, a vision is really important for any team to kind of have a medium-term picture. Where do we want to go in the future? But what we found is that the successful teams had quite the nuanced approach to developing a vision and often had to push back against senior management. We found 2 teams that got the marching order from senior management to become a world leader. One team in AI and the other team in a specific approach. So what do you do with the marching order of becoming a world leader in AI when you work in a ministry with really tight budgets and not have the possibility to employ top-notch coders and let alone to work on all aspects of AI? Those teams were really good in not only pushing back, but also looking at existing taxonomies. Here's an existing one, AI. Here's an emerging one for our directorate. And please have a look at the top right. Defining boundaries. What are capabilities we can realistically develop in-house, and where should they sit? In procurement, in partnership, in programming, in human resources? And what are capabilities and areas of work that we realistically will not be able to establish? Let's take Quoica, for example. They knew they want to support partner countries with digital systems, but they also know that they cannot recruit and sustain the engagement of top-notch digital experts. So Quoica has one person working part-time who only is tasked with scanning the horizon for top-notch digital experts to then sign partnership agreements and bring these experts in when needed for program design sessions and to provide ongoing advice, knowing that the best expertise is outside the organization. So this notion of drawing boundaries and not falling prey to McKinsey's and other consultancies to have this capability come in, but be mindful to have standing partnerships is a really important notion in capability building. And I think Rosie will pick up on this point. Now, after developing a vision, the teams that we found, they were really cognizant of the innovation characteristics. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them, just highlighting that one of the 4 that we found teams reflecting on was sustainability. How do we design a business model that enables us to have ongoing expertise in a specific area? And where should that expertise sit? Going to my previous points around functions, procurement, partnerships, and so on. Now, we also found that teams really looked at either all or most of the institutional factors. And I'll just highlight a few. And what I'd like to point out in the remaining few minutes is around metrics. I mentioned the point on results frameworks, and just to highlight, there's really interesting work in USAID on how do you actually design metrics, and in UNDP, and Christof might or might not speak to this, that incentivize this ongoing work with a specific technology that's brought out of the innovation space. Now, when it comes to partnerships, I want to highlight the good example from Quoica as just laid out, but also the good work of the UK FCDO that really looked into what are capabilities across government? How can we tap into additional expertise within our own government across ministries where there's deep expertise, in this case on behavioral science, but the FCDO also taps into top-notch expertise on, let's say, foresight across ministries. And lastly, I want to highlight how innovation teams often rethought how they look at innovations they can support with their scarce resources. And we found a clear difference between those organizations that look at every innovation initiative in terms of, do we want to support this with our time and the little funding that we have? If it's only assessed against their individual probability to unfold impact on a country level, or as part of an entire portfolio that is conducive towards adoption. In other words, if you want to have a portfolio that proves that, let's say, behavioral science should be part of the organization's toolkit, then you probably should have experiments across different thematic areas that matter to your organization and in different country typologies that matter to your organization, as opposed only to the low-hanging fruits. And with this, I want to hand back to you, Johanna, and say thank you. And I welcome any questions, but I think only after Rosie spoke. Thank you so much, everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing this, Ben. Really interesting research. I think we only scratched the surface, and I look forward to diving a little bit deeper after we've spoken to Rosie. So Rosie, welcome to the seminar. Thanks for joining the conversation. As mentioned, Rosie is a fellow at the Institute for Innovation for Public Purpose, and she's the co-author of the book, The Big Con. Rosie, are you able to turn your video on? Calling Rosie. Rosie's unable to turn video on. Olivia, can you
I think I can. Yeah, no, it says I'm unable to because the host has stopped it. So I think you need to allow me to turn my video on, perhaps.
Right. So we'll make you a co-host. Olivia to the rescue, please. Excellent. Rosie's starting to share slides in the meantime. Well, we'll just continue, Rosie. So we can start without.
Great.
Oh, there we go. Fantastic.
Yes, I think you can see me now.
And I will pin you so that everyone can see you. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences on this topic. Why are organizations struggling, and how can they move new or newish approaches to the core? Over to you for your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone at the OECD for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to put a timer on because I don't trust myself to stick to my 8 minutes. Let's see how this goes. So I think before we hear from the super interesting practical examples, I believe one of the things that I would say to talk about was also some of the kind of theoretical underpinnings of how we can understand the adoption or different ways that organizations in the public sector adopt innovations and kind of how we understand those processes. So as Joanna said, I am a PhD candidate and research fellow at University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And I'm also the co-author with Mariana Mazzucato of a book called The Big Con, which explores the political economy of the consulting industry, why it has grown, why governments are using it, and some of the implications of kind of overuse of using consultancies. And we look at this through some of the perspectives that we have from innovation economics. So some of these concepts which I'll discuss in this presentation around the relationship between learning by doing and learning by searching, or what I'm kind of calling here learning by adopting, to kind of echo some of the findings from the report as well. So I don't have long, so I just wanted to highlight something in the report that is very relevant to my own research, and I think very important, and something that often gets overlooked when we're thinking about innovation within public sector organizations in particular, and that is capacity, the existence and knowledge of abilities, the kind of skill set, the resources, the human resources and the financial resources that already exist in public sectors. We know, much like in the private sector, actually, historically, as many of you will be familiar with, many of these paradigms that we've had for thinking about innovation in the public sector have completely overlooked often the existing competences and capabilities that already exist, and this is a problem, and as we explore in the book. Now, I'm not going to go into this slide in too much detail now, but this is just some of the kind of theoretical underpinning from my work, which tries to make sense of the relationship between what we call learning by searching in the economics of innovation literature and learning by doing. So hopefully most people will be familiar, or some people will be familiar with these two terms, but if not, I'll just kind of address quickly what they refer to. So in the public sector, often when we think about how public sectors and public sector organizations act or work to address new challenges, whether they are at the level of new policy challenges or what we might call wicked problems like the climate crisis, or indeed problems and challenges that emerge within bureaucracies when new technologies emerge, for example, that are then used within the public sector, or processes need to be updated, or services need to be updated in public services in order to respond to new demographic challenges, perhaps, or changes in health within a population. Often we increasingly don't, or that there has been a tendency to look outwards, right? To look for what is happening beyond the public sector as a source of knowledge, whether that is coming from consultancies or whether that is coming from other types of expertise. And in the economics of innovation literature, when we're exploring this within the firm, this process of innovating by drawing on outside perspectives is understood or described as learning by searching. Now, in this economics of innovation literature, the ability or the capacity that exists, the routines that exist within organizations or within the firm are critical to the ability to embed that learning that has been kind of developed or that has been sought by going externally to outside actors. It's critical for being able to embed that back in within the organization. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that in the context of the public sector, we might understand that as being that kind of expertise of civil servants, of effective digital infrastructures and effective IT systems. So this literature, so this is what this describes here, that this literature describes the successful adoption of these outside-in innovation kind of forms of innovation or technological innovation of processes requires internal knowledge, resources, and experience that is the cumulative outcome of learning by doing. This is it's interesting when you speak to people who work in public sector organizations, of course, they recognize this quite intuitively. Governments require individuals, they require workforces that know how to do things because that knowledge is very specialist. It's not something that, broadly we think, or we have a tendency to think of public sector expertise as not being specialist, as being generalist. And we even describe civil servants in the UK, for example, as being generalists. But actually the literature from the economics of innovation, which, as I've said, has been developed for thinking through the firm and innovation processes within the firm, would actually also show that public sector expertise is itself a form of specialism. And again, people working in the public sector recognize this. This is relevant because this kind of hugely specialist knowledge that is developed through the different types of tasks and different types of functions that happen within public sector organizations and all organizations is what enables then these new innovations that might come from the outside to be adopted internally within public sector organizations as well. So what are the consequences of failing to address this? We explore this question through an analysis or research that we did over a long time on the growth of the consulting industry, which we describe as, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this kind of literature or some of these discussions, when I talk about the growth of the consulting industry, at the turn of the millennium, in 2000, the consulting industry consulting services, the market for consulting services was estimated to be worth around $100 billion globally. Today, it's much closer to $1 trillion, and government services have become a huge source of revenue for the consulting industry. In the book, we focus on the big three and the big four because they have particular business models and particular dynamics that we think also help to promote the use of consultancies within governments when it's not necessarily, or when it's not kind of necessary, or when actually governments should be investing internally in this kind of learning by doing. So what we have shown is that when government organizations fail to invest internally and empower public servants and people working within government organizations to innovate and to use the expertise, the specialist expertise that they have, they then lose the ability to integrate or adopt these new ways of working that might come from the outside. And this was captured, or this dynamic, this process was captured in this quote that came from a conservative peer, a conservative minister in the United Kingdom, who described how during the pandemic in the United Kingdom, where management consultancies were contracted at kind of unprecedented scale and scope, this led to an infantilization of Whitehall or of the government ministries, which was a consequence of the unacceptable reliance on expensive management consultants. So what this process, we like this term infantilization, and we actually used it in the title for the book because it quite nicely describes this process of losing capacity, of losing the ability to integrate outside innovation as well, and to even be able to make assessments about outside innovation as something that happens over time. It's a dynamic process, and it means, and it is a consequence of this kind of loss of investment in capacity and capability as well. So what are the solutions to this? What we argue in the book is that initiatives that try to introduce new types of innovation within the public services, within the public sector and within public services that are layered on top of existing organizations can be hugely valuable, but actually we need to have a more systemic approach, similar to the conclusions of the report. And this is because actually we need capacity internally in order to be able to work with other actors to develop partnerships and work collaboratively as well. Also, that these cultures that recognize the knowledge and expertise of public servants and that empower them to find solutions to challenges are important. So if we have a political economy, if we have an ideology or a culture within the public sector and within our economies that assumes that public servants don't know what they're doing, that they don't have expertise, then of course this is going to completely undermine the kind of knowledge and expertise that they have through doing their specialist positions that could also contribute to innovation over time. I think that's my time up, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosie, and thank you also for sticking to time. Always appreciated. We're now asking Ben from the OECD to come back for a Q&A with the two of you. So we have the chat box open. If you have any questions for Ben and Rosie, please put them in there. I see we have one from Pierre-Antoine. Pierre-Antoine, I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can ask your question yourself. I think let's make it not specific to the UN system, but large organizations as a whole. Yeah, do you want to come in and ask the question?
Yes. Hello, everybody, and I'm Pierre-Antoine from Haiti. So my question is about the speed at which the UN system, not only the UN system, a lot of international organizations are adopting the innovation. So I think there is a risk that comes with it. So there is the risk is like it may, result in widening the divide. So the divide at the social level or even at the institutional levels, because not all the professionals within an organization or the UN system itself will be able to pace themselves, to really catch up with all of the initiatives. So my question was, what do you at the UN system level have in place to really help manage what I can call the side effects of all of these initiatives that are ongoing? Over.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Antoine. And we're going to take a second question from Tom. Tom, I'm asking you to unmute as well. Please come in.
Thanks, Johanna. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tom. Welcome.
I have a question for Ben, because in one of the elements was said, watch out for the hype cycles out there. And you've mentioned the 2018 blockchain, and we have seen the metaverse coming now here and drone in the AI kind of field. But can we also not see these kind of hype cycles also as an excellent opportunity, not only in terms of visibility, but basically to mobilize resources and not just stick at the surface of the hype cycle, but really going deeper behind the first, let's say, technological leverage. In blockchain, we can think about decentralized systems. In metaverse, we can think about doing new things in new ways, so that the focus is not anymore on the hype of the day following the Gartner cycle, but really on the underlying values that are important, so that we're not focusing in, for example, on the metaverse on, you know, technological headsets, but really on mindsets. Because you've mentioned it, you need resources, you need budget, and sometimes hype cycles are actually a tactical move to get to that, but then really to get into the innovation culture, to do the real change beyond, let's say, the first superficial layer. So I wanted to know your reflections on that, Ben, and that's basically my reflection and question.
Thank you, Tom. Tom joining us from Turin from the ITC ILO. Ben and Rosie, do you want to take a stab at these two questions?
Rosie, would you like to go first?
I can do, yeah. I might address the second question first, if that's okay, just because I'm not sure I totally understood the first question. But for the second question, and perhaps could you type the question in the comment box for the person who asked the first one. But for the second question, just very quickly, you know, I think the issue of hype cycles is exactly why we need then to have capacity internally to be able to make the kinds of assessments about what is valuable for the organization. And to have this kind of expertise, and that can be horizon scanning, or this, you know, these kind of capabilities that is written about in the report and that Ben talked about, but it also requires this kind of specialist knowledge or this practical context knowledge about how the organization works. Because if you don't have that, then it's much easier to, you know, fall prey to hype cycles in many contexts. And we have some of these cases in the book where, for example, you know, new AI technologies were procured by health systems or health services, and that was because the argument that the civil servants made afterwards was that we were unable to make assessments about the claims that these companies were making to us about the kinds of things that these technologies could do. We didn't have the capabilities to do that inside internally, and there was something of the emperor's new clothes about it. So again, you know, I just reiterate, you know, that this, you know, attests to this being a kind of systemic or a need to address innovation structures as a systemic issue.
Thanks, Rosie, and thanks, Pierre-Antoine and Tom. I think I can answer them almost in combination, but starting with Pierre-Antoine, the way I understood your question is a really good one. I'm not going to name names, but I can particularly think of a few UN agencies who have quite a few change management initiatives that are related to innovation in place, where I think the absorptive capacity of people in the organization is surpassed. And I do think that instead of giving the marching order, innovate and use, and now fill in the blank, you know, this technology, that approach, and this approach, to kind of say, we think that working with specific approaches such as behavioral science, such as solution search, or structured and ethical experimentation should be part of our toolkit. Now we will explore this and we'll build an evidence base, and it will take us most likely 5-6 years to make that case. But this is what I commit to as senior leader of this organization. And here is a marching order for my innovation teams and all program teams that I support with. What I instead see is more, this should be used. And very often kind of this marching order then doesn't last because it's restricted or limited to a few individuals. So I'm not saying this solves the problem, but I think reframing it and saying like, this is a structured testing, and doing so by also saying, and then we will work on communicating to all staff, when should it be used and how can you draw the expertise for using it that we have in-house and externally, as Rosie said, I think would make it much easier and take away some of the negative pressure of staff when it comes to you should innovate and you have to use AI now. So that's what we try to push forward as a practice with this adoption work, to a little bit reframe the use of approaches and technologies towards institutional capabilities, making it easier across functions, but being very specific what kind of capabilities you should have. And I think, Tom, that links partially at least to your question. I think you answered it a bit yourself. Of course, you should use high cycles as springboards. And I want to give a shout out to Franz von Weizsäcker, who's also with us, who led the GIZ blockchain lab. And I think that's a really great example where a team leveraged the hype cycle, the interest of senior management. And as you can imagine, pretty soon then advised internally on when not to use the technology, but how to go about addressing a specific challenge with other ways. It's not exactly what you meant, Tom, as far as I understood you, but I think it's a good example of leveraging hype to then dig deeper on how technologies, various technologies, can be meaningfully used to address development challenges.
Thank you so much, Ben and Rosie, for taking those. We're running slightly behind, but Rosie, maybe a 30-second observation or 30-second thoughts on a question from Emmy. Any thoughts on public sector scaling as a pathway for sustainability and the role of development partners in that? 30 seconds.
Ooh, so I was just taking a look at the other questions as well. Public sector scaling as a pathway for sustainability. I'm not entirely sure if I know exactly what you mean by that question. There was a really good question on the role of development organizations and international organizations, and whether some of these dynamics that we identify in the book can also become embedded within them. And I think you know, they're very different dynamics, but I think it's important to also recognize, you know, that unless there is, and I've done lots of interviews, I've done a lot of research also with international organizations and development agencies. I think it's really important to be aware of how some of these dynamics around short-termism, with the types of short-term contracts that are often available as the kind of resources that development agencies and international organizations offer when they work in other countries. Some of these kind of similar dynamics that undermine this cumulativity that is necessary for the development of capacity internally can also occur in this sort of consulting and advice as well. But, you know, hopefully not within, I'm sure not within any of the organizations that are here today, because we were aware of these problems.
Excellent. Thanks so much to the two of you for sharing your insights. We're quickly going to say Kate Pfehlenberg works for a US agency. She also said it shares the frustration, absolutely, so it resonates. Simple way would be budget requirements, less on consultants and more on local system strengthening by engagement, not trainings, not just trainings would be a good first step. Kate, I think that's a great suggestion. Thanks for sharing that. Thanks to the two of you, and we move to our next segment. Now we want to hear from colleagues who have actually managed to embed new approaches and technologies in the organizations and bring them to the core. And with that, I'm really thrilled to welcome Reena to the seminar. As mentioned, she's the organizational learning specialist at USAID, and they have managed to mainstream an approach into the work of the organization. Reena, I'm looking forward to hearing from you how you have achieved that and what advice you can pass on to others who are trying to. Welcome. We can't hear you. You need to unmute, please, Reena. I need to unmute you. We need to unmute you. Okay, we will do this. We're going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here. And I think you guys are going to project my slides. I think it's been fascinating to listen to the beginning of this session, because I do actually think I had not actually put it in those particular terms for myself, but I think the case of collaborating, learning, and adapting at USAID does illustrate a lot of those principles that we've been discussing, and is in some ways a case study for learning by doing, and kind of the really deep translation and long-term integration work that is needed to bring external expertise really deeply into the fabric of a federal agency. So I realize we have a very short time, so let me jump right in. If you could go to the next slide for me, please. Okay, so let me give you the very, very quick explanation of our innovation. And I'm not going to go in a lot of detail. There's clearly, I could probably give an 20-minute presentation, of course, just on this. But this is the Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting framework, which is basically USAID has taken all of, about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we took all of the research and evidence that we could find within the field of organizational development, knowledge management, and organizational learning, and pulled it together into a framework that translated it into what does this mean for USAID. So if you look at the red half of this framework, it talks about collaborating, learning, and adapting in the program cycle. That's USAID's operational model for doing programming. And so basically asking ourselves this question: are we strategically making decisions about how to collaborate with the right people at the right time in order to avoid the stovepiping that often plagues our development programs? Learning, are we asking the right questions and timing our answers so that we can actually apply what we have learned, and then adapting. Are we using the evidence and learning that we're bringing in from collaborating and learning and actually making programmatic and operational decisions based on that? The right hand of the framework is the enabling conditions. And this is half of our framework, because it's the insight here is that you really cannot make those programmatic changes without those cultural and enabling environment changes. So how do our organization's culture, our processes, our resources, the unspoken norms, the incentives, how does all of that either support or hinder different aspects of CLA? I could say a lot more there, but I'm going to move right on to the next slide and give you a very quick history of how we got here. So first of all, we didn't just kind of make this framework up here at headquarters. It was co-created with USAID Uganda as part of a strategic planning process. And then we advocated for it internally and built it into our operational policy. The USAID's program site, USAID was standing up a bureau to determine operational policy, and we built CLA into that programming policy so that it would be a piece of it. We then piloted and learned and used the experience of the first few missions who were really on board with this, the early adopters, to help advocate internally and also showcase those examples. And then, because we were part of this bureau, which had a mandate to help operationalize, our whole operational policy, the program cycle, we leveraged that and used that, the fact that we had sort of slipped in to become part of a broader operational model to kind of get more to scale. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Oh, you know what? Actually, let me highlight the USAID Learn contract. Again, you guys can have access to these slides, but all of this was being driven internally. So this was a collaboration between headquarters and field based on what problems we were experiencing in our organization, and then bringing in external expertise. Well, bringing in external fields of knowledge that we translated together to meet our needs. But we still didn't have enough capacity to kind of make all of the changes that we wanted to make, develop all the tools we wanted to make. And so USAID brought on a Learn contract. And it was this, I've never experienced anything like working with a Learn contract. It was like a partnership. It was as though our internal team expanded to include 50 more people with expertise on all kinds of specific areas related to CLA and communication and change management. So if you could go on to the next slide, I think you can kind of see what happened. We put a lot of work into making that relationship what it was. And as part of that relationship, we were able to kind of, before that, the Learn contract came on, I think there were those islands of innovation that folks have described. Some people intuitively understood what CLA was. What we were able to do together when we had that resourcing was to develop that framework that I showed you, to develop the toolkits, this infrastructure of institutionalizing and codifying what had previously been just a collection of ideas and good practices. So we could really have a clear framework and set of tools and organize ways for those islands of excellence, those champions, to connect with each other, both within the agency and outside the agency. I'm not going to, again, talk through this in great detail. I'll just say these highlighted pieces in the timeline are things that I'm going to speak to on the further slide. They're just examples of ways that we built these tools and systems and processes internally to meet that need that had been identified and to institutionalize this. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the CLA maturity tool. So I had showed you, I apologize, I need to fix my settings there. I had showed you the CLA framework previously. You may notice that there are these 6 components, the wedges of the circle. There are 16 subcomponents within them. So for example, under adapting, we have pause and reflect and adaptive management. And each one of those subcomponents has, what we did is we developed a maturity model that defines each of those subcomponents on a scale from not yet present through institutionalized. And I think the insight here is that often when we want people to do something new or different, we say, hey, look, here's what it could look like when you're really doing it. And everybody thinks to themselves, okay, but I'm over here, and how do I get there? And what does that journey look like? And so this is a tool to kind of help identify what those stages in between look like. And I think also part of the insight here is to look at this holistic framework, pick a couple of areas that you really want to advance in, and then dig into where you are and where you realistically can get to given your existing resources over the next year. So kind of keeping the big picture in mind, but also being really targeted about which aspects of this innovation really make sense in your particular context, since we have offices all around the world. And also, thinking about what that change pathway would be for you and not expecting it to be perfect. Maybe we're at emergent on this particular component and we just want to get to expanding because that's where we really need to be right now. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So this is something else that we did, our internal team with the support of the Learn contract. We implemented a 4-year learning agenda to understand whether and under what conditions CLA contributes to increased organizational effectiveness and improved development results. This was our broad theory of change, was that by integrating CLA, we would increase USAID's organizational effectiveness and also improve development results, and that those two outcomes would also be mutually reinforcing. So the findings address a full range of the CLA components. It includes literature reviews, summaries. We have a case competition where we source stories and examples, and we did syntheses of those. We used the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey and broke down the answers to the questions to connect CLA with employee engagement and therefore effectiveness. So we can drop the link to this into the chat. Heather, actually, I have a colleague on here, maybe she can do that. But I thought it did very much help us tell the story and empower our champions all over the agency to pull pieces of this evidence in order to advocate for different parts of CLA. Next slide, please.
And Reena, in the interest of time, I'm going to give you the 1-minute warning, please.
Perfect. All right, we're almost there. So again, I can kind of skip through some of this. This is just other things we built. We built, we hold a case competition, and we have sourced over 500 case studies of CLA in action from partners and from USAID. We have a toolkit that is publicly available to us and our partners. Next slide. We have a training that we give ourselves internally. It's a ton of work and a ton of effort for us to do this training ourselves, but we get a lot of amazing feedback on the training. People think it's the best training they've taken at USAID because we do have that internal expertise and understanding. This is just a tool that we share during the training about how individuals can find those change pathways for themselves on how to integrate CLA. Next slide. This is our current theory of change on my team. So in the post-Learn era, that was a 5-year contract, and our resources have kind of contracted again somewhat. And so we've also realized we're in a different phase of institutionalization now. And I'm happy to speak more to this if someone has a question about it. But I think the basic instinct is that we have several different work streams, including like relationships and networks and policy and leadership advocacy, et cetera, these kinds of things that we do ourselves. And we use a behavioral science principles focusing on how do we across our own agency increase motivation, opportunities, and ability for people to do this. And then we follow that change pathway to how it will lead to the results we want. Next slide. These are just some lessons that I have, again, in my own words, and I think they fit somewhat with the models that we were speaking about. Pilot, refine, and scale, use examples to stimulate demand. I've talked about a lot of these. Something that maybe I haven't spoken about is show, don't tell. I think people have trouble understanding what this really means until they see it in practice, and then they get it and they gives attention. It was really, really important to take the external expertise and embed it within an emerging infrastructure of our own internal policy and capacity building. And I think having a standard process with also customization was really important. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Reena. Sorry for cutting you short. I think we could
No,
have
thank
talked
you for
about
the time,
this.
Jack. I appreciate it.
No, I think we could have talked about this a lot longer, and we're going to make the full deck available, of course, together with key resources on CLA, and we'll come back later to you in the Q&A. So thanks for now. And I'd like to invite Christof, please, to come, our last speaker. Christof is part of the team that is driving digital transformation at UNDP, the Digital Innovation Specialist. Christof, thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to hear what UNDP is doing to bring digital to the core. Over to you, please.
Great. Thanks for having me. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And also to see a couple of familiar names in the audience. So really good to be here. And maybe a short reflection up front. In the beginning of the webinar today, we talked a lot about innovation. And then maybe as a fun fact, I don't quite know what it means, but we actually barely ever use the word innovation in our team. So we're practicing digital. And I think you're going to share my slides, right? Yes. Because today I'm going to give you a brief overview of UNDP's digital transformation, all the different work that we do here. But before we get started, on the next slide, a little forward, what does it actually mean when you talk about digital, right? And getting digital into our work. And it's really about digital at the core is how can we get digital thinking into our programming at scale, right? And what does it mean when we say digital, right? It is a realization that we talk about using digital technologies in our programming, and that as a development organization, we have to contribute to digital results or inclusive digital societies, right? So it's always a duality that we have to focus on when we talk digital. And in that sense, digital is not only about emerging tech or pioneering innovation, but very often it is about actually more robust, proven solutions that you can really deploy at scale in a development context. Okay, so let's keep that in mind when I'll take you through some of the things we do to drive our digital transformation. Next slide, please. I'm trying to use the adoption framework that Ben has introduced earlier today. So next slide, and let's get started with having a look at the clear mandate. So when we talk about innovation and technology, we actually have at least 3 units at UNDP that focus on innovation and technology. Right? We have our strategic innovation colleagues, we have our accelerator labs colleagues, and I've seen some of them in the audience. It's really great pleasure to always work with you. And then we have the digital office, right? And maybe as a side note, for example, the digital office is set up in our executive office, right? So we're not part of programming or part of IT, which gives space for such a new change unit to grow. And then talking about mandate, we have digital anchored as an enabler in our strategic plan. And we have written our own digital strategy for UNDP. And we also had to think, what does it mean for UNDP? What is our mandate to actually do work in the digital space? And we basically concluded here that it's really about the leaving no one behind, the human rights-based approach in digital societies, what we want to aim at. Okay, so that's about the mandate. I'm skipping the learning culture because we just heard a lot from Albim around learning culture and CDO, the digital office as such. We're only one of many units looking at learning culture. But here, how to create an organizational context, right? And so really how to change the nuts and bolts of organization, how to adapt our business processes. First thing is results framework or global KPI. We do have tier 2 output indicators related to digital. So not counting internal number of digital projects, but how many people do we actually have benefit from digital tech solutions? How many governments do we support in digital policies, strategies, laws, and so on, right? So that is right there, right at the core of what we do in our impact results framework. And of course, we have a number of internal performance indicators as well. Also, we have linked or we've added digital to the quality assurance of our country program documents, right? So all these 4-year documents, whenever they get approved, they had to also pass a certain digital hurdle. And we are also tracking that in one of our results framework performance indicators. We have made digital a corporate priority in our annual planning and reporting cycles. And we're nudging our country offices to adopt enabling actions related to data and digital in our annual planning and reporting processes. And then at the project level, we've updated all the project templates. We have added digital and data to the project QA. We have actually introduced, for example, digital output markers. And let me pause here because Ben was mentioned it a little bit earlier. I mean, we're really tracking to what degree is every project output that we deliver globally enabled for digital technology, right? I mean, these are great insights and can tell us a lot about how future smart we are as UNDP. And obviously, guidance for our colleagues when we nudge them to work more digitally or with more data, and the guidance has to be placed wherever people are actually stumbling across a certain step in their business processes where they would want to make use of digital or data. So it's very important to place it everywhere where it really matters. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at collaboration. Here, zooming in to some of our internal collaboration. The first one is actual digital transformation programming. That's a little bit less collaborative, but as digital office, we first had to build a foundation here. What does it mean to actually do development programming in digital transformation, right? So we created a digital transformation framework together with the G20 and the Digital Global Compact. We're working on digital public infrastructure. We've developed digital assessments, supporting government partners with digital transformation strategies. So, right, it's digital programming in its own right. But then when it comes to the collaboration and partnerships, we have our global policy network where we're working with our thematic experts on how to insert digital into the integrated offers. How can we co-develop new offers, right? That can that are fit for 21st century. And then, for example, we've co-developed a large number of thematic digital guides that are based on our DT framework, or we conduct digital sprints with the thematic units to come up with digital tech solutions that can be used in certain thematic areas. We're also collaborating with our innovation partners, right? So, for example, we're trying to further templatize how to create digital transformation portfolios for our government partners. And then with our country offices, there is a large catalog of third-party digital solutions that we actually vet so that it's easier to actually currently deploy for country offices. And likewise, we also have a small in-house digital studio that can help our programming colleagues with digital tech solutions and help with the creation of digital public goods, for example. And the last collaboration also with IT management, of course, when it comes to the in-house digital skills building, especially to the direction of collaboration and office productivity. Next slide, please. And that's already the last one. What we have here is then, what do we do about internal capacity building, right? On the one hand, we have the digital fitness program. It's basically online or offline intensive trainings for our programming and policy colleagues. There are dedicated e-learnings and learning communities that we have in our internal networks. Then we have created dedicated networks for digital, right? We have now a digital community of practice, which is actually with a rather large number of colleagues. We have a digital advocate network where every office and every unit has actually mandated one person that can also allocate time to this network to become part of the global network of digital capacity at UNDP. And we're trying to see how we can insert digital into our existing country office support mechanisms, right? I mean, sometimes we do some country office support directly as digital office, but that is not scalable. So how can we actually multiply and get it into the existing support mechanisms and work through our regional bureaus? Then thought leadership, yes, it's important to have internal, external experts to have publications on certain technology pieces and develop guidance documents, and then disseminate it through basically any channel available, right? Newsletters, SharePoint, knowledge management, and the above mentioned networks. Just get the message out there as much as you can, the more the merrier. And talking about capacities, we also have job descriptions. We've tried to add digital and data competencies to all the existing job descriptions. And here we're talking really about full-on job descriptions at UNDP. And we're developing new job descriptions for dedicated digital and data capabilities that were not there before. And lastly, maybe if we can't have a certain capability in-house, then of course we procure it from the outside. And here we're working at the moment on a new global LTA for digital services, and we want to set up then, for example, an in-house tour review service for our country offices, because sometimes it's not that easy to actually define a TOR for a highly specialized digital technology. Thank you. Next slide. I think I'm already at the end. Yes. So in short, as CDO, what you've heard between the lines is, there's sometimes you have to do pioneer work as a digital change unit and define things that haven't been there before. Very often it's about multiplying. So rather than doing one thing one time yourself, which is not scalable, right? So how can you really multiply all your efforts so that it actually builds internal capacity? And then also, let's be humble. There's so much great digital work happening all over UNDP that is actually not linked yet or was not introduced by the digital office. And then we want to identify these gems and actually help to amplify them, right? And it's also one of our goals. So thank you. I hope I raced you through in a somewhat understandable way through all the different things that we do here. Thank you. Back over to you, Anna.
You raced us through and we understood it. And I think, Christof, I want to say thank you, and I want to add partner with others and make knowledge available to your last slide, because UNDP has been such a great supporter, making everything that you do available. I'm a fan of Digital X and a user of the Digital Studio, so slightly biased. We have questions coming in for you and Reena. Reena, if you want to come back on video, and I hope you'll be able to unmute yourself when the questions come in. And the first, Cal, I'm going to ask you to unmute to ask the question yourself. I think it was specific to Reena, but I think it also applies to Christof. What do you reckon?
Absolutely. So thanks so much. Both of my questions are adoption questions. I know what it means in Reena's case. I'd love to hear if they're relevant to Christof's case. The first one had to do with interest across USAID in applying CLA. So I'm reading a little bit between the lines on your 80 missions statistic, but it sounds like it's opt-in rather than mandated. And so I was curious to understand, how do you build that interest to get people to want to do it across the organization? And the second piece is, it sounds like this has been integrated into a lot of the guidance and maybe some of the internal systems and processes, and typically that's something that requires a lot of political will, and so I was interested to know a bit about how that political will was built to make those changes.
Yeah, both great questions, and I could probably go on for a good while on both of them, but I'll just be brief here. First of all, it is both mandated and opt-in. There are some key places where it is mandated, where missions are required to do certain things. So, for example, we have 5-year country strategies, and it is mandatory for all of our overseas missions, our overseas offices, to do what we call a pause and reflect, a mid-course stock taking of their 5-year strategy. So everybody has to do that. It's a clear entry point for learning and adapting. So what we have done, but we've been pretty strategic about what we require, because it's very hard to say, thou shalt think strategically about how you learn and adapt and collaborate, right? So we really don't want it to be a box checking exercise, but we want to create enough of a mandate so that it prompts people to ask the question, what should I be doing here? And for the champions to have a path in. So I could share a lot more about that. We've thought very, very carefully about what to mandate, and then how to focus most of our energy on the tools, resources. Again, that sort of behavioral science, people having the capacity and the desire to actually do this. The way we build political will is by connecting it to what people really care about their work. So, the USAID is an incredibly mission-driven place. People want to, they want to spend their time doing the work. They want to spend their time getting the development results. And so our training, for example, is called CLA for Better Development Results. So we never, ever advocate doing CLA for its own sake. We advocate doing CLA to help solve the core problems that you're having in order to get it in the way of your work. And so I think that's been a key messaging piece for us and has really helped us build the political will.
Christof, you want to add?
Yeah, I can. Thanks. Here, I think, especially in the case of digital, there's a lot of pull, right? I mean, country offices, government partners, everybody wants to, develop a better understanding of how to deal with digital transformation, right? And so in that sense, we can also go quite well with a mix of opt-in and mandated, right? So there's certain quality assurance aspects that are mandated, so certain hurdles that you have to jump. But then a lot is actually also opt-in because, for example, what we always say is not every project needs to be digital, right? Not by far, but you have to prove that you actually consider digital technologies. And if you can prove that traditional ways are more efficient and effective, well, then please use it, right? Because that's what it's all about in the end. But probably bottom line, the further we progress into the 21st century, the more likely it will be that there will be certain pieces of digital data technologies and actually most of our project activities in one way or another. And yeah, that's what we're trying to prepare the organization for. And so, and back to political will and opt-in or mandated, you can actually do a lot of opt-in and positive incentives because, yeah, people want it, right? So it works quite well.
Anything that makes our lives easier, right? While I've got you both here, I have another question that I want to come to as a wrap-up one, but I do want to ask if we can share your slides with everyone in the audience. We've been getting questions about the recording. I'm seeing nodding. Christof is nodding. Kind of. Okay, so we'll make those available and include all the links that you shared as well. And now I want to go with the last question to James Powell. James, you should be able to unmute yourself. Do you want to come in? Oh, and we're getting applause. Yeah. So I'm passing the applause on to you guys. James, please, welcome.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks, Joanna. James from UNICEF. Really enjoyed the presentations, and Christof was really insightful to see your digital compass. We're also working on digital transformation here at UNICEF as part of the change strategy that comes under the part of Office for Innovation's work. I'm really interested to see the compass and the other tools associated. Could you speak a little bit more about how you're working with member states and partner governments in using the tool, participation with it, feedback from it, and how it's helped you in kind of developing your strategies and approaches to digital transformation with partner governments?
Thanks, James. That's a big question. Christof, I'm going to give you a minute
I'll give a very quick answer.
And I'm going to be very happy to connect you guys afterwards.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say. I'm also happy to connect you to the colleagues who have actually developed the digital compass. In brief, for those who don't know, digital compass is basically pulling all publicly available open data related to digital transformation one way or another together and tries to map that onto our digital transformation framework. And then we try to also develop some maturity levels around it. And the idea here is that it can actually complement. Typically what we do is called the digital readiness assessments, right? It's more a traditional research scheme and survey in a country to understand the digital readiness in a country. And then it's actually interesting to contrast these two, right? So here's the hands-on research and here's actually the openly available data. And then if you combine those two, you can have a better understanding of what's actually really going on. And based on that, develop your advisory and strategies and so on and so forth, right? Into the details, how the compass works and how we have developed it, etc. I would really love to connect with you outside of this conversation, and I can connect it to, directly to the colleagues who have developed it.
Excellent. I love it when connections happen. I love it even more when we can facilitate them. So thank you for that. I've shared your details with James, and I hope it'll be fruitful. On that note, we are just over time. I'm still counted as in time. I'm going to say thank you very much to the two of you. Thank you to Rosie. Thank you to Pilar and Ben, to everyone for sharing your insights with us here. Again, I'm seeing hearts, I'm seeing applause come in. So hopefully this has resonated and everyone who was online learned a lot from your insights. As I said, we'll make a recording of the session available. We'll share key resources. We'll try and share all the presentations. And hope you'll be joining us for future conversations of the OECD I-32 group and the UN Innovation Network. And with that, wishing you all a very good day. Big thank you to you for joining and again to our presenters. Have a good day. Bye, everyone.